Yeah, I'll take that one too. Okay. When I first offered to give a talk on this subject, I was thinking it would be something like one of my talks on Locke, perhaps, or maybe on the German Historical School, maybe even Jefferson or something like that. But there is a piece of mine that seems to be floating around that everyone always lands on, and that is a review of Frederick Taylor's book, The Downfall of Money, which came out in 2013. And I was asked to review that, not because I'm a specialist in that particular period. My own area, as you saw from the little blurb, I guess, that was sent out, is American intellectual history and German intellectual history through the 19th century. So I guess in one sense, it is sort of the end of that period. I mean, this World War I marks pretty much the death of that world that is part of my focus on the historical school and its origins. But I reviewed the book in part because I was interested in what were the forces that really brought that world to an end. And this was a very particularly interesting, gripping narrative that was told by Taylor. And I had presented it in fairly succinct form and thought that he had confirmed a fairly long-standing interpretation that hyperinflation in Germany was one of the things that had essentially so deranged society as to permit eventually the rise of various factions, left and right, but provided the, how would you say, the fertile ground in which National Socialism and the Second World War could come into being. And so that went online. And then not too long after that, and it's still up, so you can still find it, someone brought to my attention that The Economist had actually published a review. Not a review of the book, but a review of that history in which the book is cited as source evidence for the fact that it was not the hyperinflation that did all of that, but it was in fact the Bruning deflation. And that is, of course, to say the deflation caused by the Great Depression. And I looked at that and I was quite irritated because I was fairly certain that I had read the same book and that was exactly not the conclusion to which the author had come. And so when Alberto said, I want you to talk on that, I decided that that would be my opportunity to address that thorn in my side, to finally pluck it out and do a little research. Far worse than just saying, and they cited Paul Krugman along with Taylor to make their point, or their lack of one. They said that academic opinion was actually quite well informed that it was not hyperinflation that had anything to do with the rise of National Socialism. Now, any historian worth his salt is not going to be a monocausal type. There isn't just one thing that causes an event. But I don't think any historian that I was aware of, and I have been trained by some very good ones, had ever said that it did not play a role, and many of them did say that it played a central role. Maybe not the only role, but certainly a central role. I mean, there were other disasters too. Let's not forget, just 2 years before, less than 2 years before, the hunger blockade had been lifted. A lot of people had suffered as a result of that. And then you have the hyperinflation. And then you do have the Great Depression. We're not saying that these things weren't important, but in order to explain why it is that Germans have a particular fear of inflation, people generally have gone back to that moment. And they have connected it up with the events that did lead to the outbreak of the war and to National Socialism. So I decided, in part, what I was going to do is research the various writers who've been looking into this and basically show how that contention that academic opinion wasn't in favor of it was simply wrong. Well, and I didn't have to go terribly far because it just so happened that Emilio had acquired some of the primary texts on the hyperinflation and its history. And so one of those is a very extensive work by Gerald Feldman, over 1,000 pages, in which the primary thesis of that text is that this was the thing that had deranged the morals, the outlook, the sense of hope the ability even to conceptualize a coherent plan of everyday existence. He basically put that in his book, and it's an over 1,000-page discussion of it with a very extensive historiography. So whatever Krugman was trying to do, whatever the economist was trying to do, Krugman called it bad history, saying that hyperinflation was involved. The economist said that it was the hyperinflation phobia. That's what they called it. Well, I can honestly say that that's not the case. It's not a phobia. It was quite traumatic. Now, I was curious. Why would economists say this? That same article even cited John Maynard Keynes, who had actually said that the hyperinflation was really bad. And if they had just gone a little further, they would have found a couple of other very famous economists. Lionel Robbins said that he actually wrote the foreword to one of the great, in fact, the very first. You know, a lot of economists don't know that this is the very first. Many of them start with Kagan in that book. It was edited by Milton Friedman in 1957. It was an examination of hyperinflation. And they start there. So that's 1957. But in 1937, Costantino Bresciani Tironi had written the most incisive and precise analysis of that. The title of it is The Economics of Inflation, a study of currency depreciation in post-war Germany. I'm not sure what the Italian title would have been, but both of them noted that one of the things that occurs in the course of a hyperinflation is that there is a tremendous sense of foreboding, a tremendous sense of the incalculability of tomorrow, the fact that you can't plan for even the smallest things. And when that happens, life becomes a gamble. Both of them wrote about this and talked about how, in the case of Costantino Tironi, this is how he said it. It caused incalculable moral and intellectual values to be destroyed, provoked a serious revolution in social classes, a few people accumulating wealth and forming a class of usurpers of national property whilst millions of individuals were thrown into poverty. It was a distressing preoccupation and constant torment of innumerable families. It poisoned the German people by spreading among all classes the spirit of speculation and by diverting them from proper and regular work. And it was the cause of incessant political and moral disturbance. It is indeed easy enough to understand why the record of the sad years 1919 to 1923. The inflation begins earlier. It becomes really hyperinflation, though, in 1992, but it's bad enough in 1919. Why that period always weighs like a nightmare on the minds of the German people. Now, how it is that the economists could miss that? That was one of my big questions. Why would they say what they did? Now, there is a way when you're looking at economics and economic relations, you're interested in the formal rules that govern exchange and currency. And you could do what Hayek called a sort of pure calculus of choice, logical analysis of the consequences that follow when you manipulate those rules or you attempt to change them. And from a purely formal perspective, you could say, looking at this hyperinflation, that what happens at the end of the day? Some people get rich, some people get poor. Well, what the heck? It's not good, it's bad for everybody, but at the end of the day, you just have reshuffled the decks. And in fact, that's what the economists said. Just the decks were reshuffled. But once the Rentenmark comes in, at the end of 1923, the Rentenmark is based upon a kind of land bank of German mortgages and industrial capital backing it, and then they take and convert all of the Reichsmarks to the Rentenmark, and very quickly they just drain out all of that excess inflation. The economist says, look, once that's done, everything goes back to equilibration. Prices are again functioning and people can plan. That's interesting. And that's it. That's all the damage that was caused. There was just a little reshuffling of the decks. Some people got hurt, but some people actually benefited. If you were an industrialist, if you had hard assets, if you were a farmer and had a good amount of land, well, you were okay. Generally speaking, if you were able to take your assets, say you were one of the great industrialists, Hugo Stinnes of that time period. I mean, he was the wealthiest of all for a time. He did not want the inflationary policy. He did not push the inflationary policy. A lot of people did mark him out, and some tried to scapegoat or blame him and others of his class. But if it was going to happen, he was not going to be impoverished by it. So he moved his assets into pounds and other foreign notes. And as the inflation then rose to the high levels that it did, he came in, and everybody else that was desperate, he bought up all of those assets for pennies on the mark, let's say the dollar, and came out to be the most successful of all of the investors of that period. So one could look at that, and just looking at the formal, the unintended consequences that result from the functioning of, or I should say, the malfunctioning of the rules of commerce and of currency when they are interfered with, you could say that that it was simply a reshuffling of the deck. But there are other kinds of costs, hidden costs, that go well beyond that. You know, Bastiat said that what we're interested in. What's up? Oh, did we lose transmission? Okay.
No.
Okay. I'll get to that other chart in just a moment. That he's interested in the unseen phenomena. And it's true that the economist still looks to the unseen, but they can't quite go deep enough, because much of the unseen cost is actually in the conceptual carnage that's caused when your everyday ability to do just normal things is interrupted. Now, we all know how easy it is to plan your day now. How easy it is to measure time, keep track of it, have your whole calendar here. We know now that you could pay for everything from here. I mean, Doug wanted to get an Uber to get over here. I wanted to walk, partly because, you know, you feel reality more instead of this attenuated modernity of the phone, but that's okay. And we just take it for granted. Everyday life should be that way. And your plans can actually be quite complex without feeling so complicated. They take into account a lot of information in such a quick and rapid and easy way. Well, one of the very first innovations to make your life easy in this way was cash, was currency. Before that, it was much more difficult to engage in trade. You had to find people that, you know, had what you needed, and what maybe they would, maybe you would have what they wanted, hopefully, or you could both find something that you could agree on to trade in, that you could say, well, I could probably trade it down the road to somebody else, oxen, goats, what have you, gold, silver. And then when that really begins to take on, you develop a general rule in the use of money. But something then becomes an exchangeable item that you can use so that you can then plan down the road what you're going to do. Now, in modern life, and this happens actually quite very, very early on, but we take that really for granted. And paper money was a very big advance above just hard cash. So when the very first real experience with modern hyperinflation comes along, people are absolutely shocked and disturbed by it. Now, in researching what actually goes on in the mind, it makes sense that one is going to look at an interpretation of how concepts come to form our conscious thoughts. And the school of thought that first was interested in the content of purposeful human action was not the Austrians, actually. It was the German historical school. And one of the guys who actually focused on how the content of purposes really matters with respect to money happened to be the premier student of the dean of the German historical school himself. That is to say, he was a student of Gustav Schmoller. Do any of you know Gustav Schmoller? Of course. He had that big fight with Menger in Austria. That was the Methodenstreit. And so that fight was over how one ought to conceptualize economics. Now, there's a lot that's wrong with Schmoller's approach to it all. But what they were trying to say was simply this: to what extent does the particular purpose, the particular values, the particular ways in which people make plans and form their concepts actually matter to the development of economic processes? Or can you just say purposes in general and make no distinction? Values, whatever aims, goals, ends, make no difference as long as it's just purposefulness. Can you just drive economic theory just from that? Well, Schmoller was of the view that no, the actual content of the purposes matter. And one of his very best students, and this may surprise people, but one that he was always touting up and was quite keen on promoting was Georg Simmel. Many of you might know Georg Simmel as one of the founding fathers of modern sociology, along with Weber and a bunch of others. That would be true. In fact, I would make a strong case that a lot of that stuff that was associated with the German historical school went on and evolved and became what we now today call sociology. Well, Bernd Wittig did an excellent book. As you can see, I have looked at it. I did have a color coding that was to relate to the particular themes, and then I got confused and lost. I forgot which one meant which, so it's now utterly useless to me. What's that?
We need it now.
I need it. But if you want a really interesting account based upon Simmel sociology and the sociology of one other, Elias Canetti, you want to look at this book, Culture and Inflation in Weimar Germany. And it will take you through some of the major representatives of German culture, that is to say in German literature, in film, in poetry, in art, and so forth. And he will go through and show how these changes developed over the course of the hyperinflation. Now, he takes Simmel because Simmel has a very sensitive treatment of time horizons and their relationship to planning. And Simmel wants to say that in modern life, money allows for the extension of plans over a longer time horizon. People can defer because they can save so that they can spend later or invest later. In fact, when they invest, they mean to earn an income so that they might be then able to pursue another goal later on. And what he calls this is an extension of series of concepts or conceptual series. And he says in modern life, those conceptual series become quite long and quite sophisticated. Again, people take them for granted. All the various things that you do during the course of the day are part of the series that you have connected that inform, or at least I should say, provide you the roadmap by which you pursue the fundamental values that define who you are, what you're interested in, what you want to do. Much of this it's fascinating. It maps on to conceptions of the brain that we are now confirming in terms of how it operates. I just did a conference on the sensory order, and we had some experts there who talked about how the brain absorbs sensory inputs, maps that imagery into various points in the mind, so that patterns then are laid down that are the very source material of memory. Well, if you can think about it, if you take another great Italian discussion of the early stages of a child's development, that's the absorbent mind stage. Do you know who I might be referring to? She was Maria Montessori, of course. And she said that this is when identity and ideas of what is right behavior, wrong behavior, you are absorbing what others are doing, what your parents are doing. They're modeling things for you. And so these very core values are laid down at a very early stage. Well, Simmel said, you know, you can see in traditional face-to-face communities, what anthropologists now call traditional face-to-face communities. We're talking at a time when commerce is very minimal, if at all. In fact, Simmel used the word primitive. We don't use that word any longer. But he said in earlier stages, these series of means to ends were shorter. They tended to be highly prescribed. People, there was a certain set number of ways to do things and a certain set number of ends that identified your community and your group, basically giving you your place in that society. Tradition, that's why we call it in anthropology traditional societies. Now, these don't go away. We still have an absorbent mind period, and we still have community. We have, in German, they call it Gemeinschaft, yes? But those extended conceptual chains that Simmel is referring to map on to those formal rules in economics. Those things that allow us to defer gratification, to defer consumption, to be able to plan, to be able to take certain things for granted, to be able to store up value and be able to use it later. Our time horizons are expanded, and along with them, our conceptual series are expanded. And so he talked about how there were differences in the responses of modern men often from those of more traditional societies, that when they discover something new, the modern is very likely to sit back and try to figure out what the logical connections were that made it work. To those that do not have that frame of mind, though, who see it now for the very first time and they're from this more traditional background, the excitement, it beckons to them to try to identify what is the immediate cause, not knowing that there are these longer unseen chains of causality at work in the processes of these formal rules. So Simmel went to great length to discuss that in his book on the philosophy of money. That came out in 1900, The Philosophy of Money. I don't know if yes, there it is. He's at the very end. And so time coordination in traditional versus modern life. That's just what I've talked about. Now, when you have hyperinflation, all of a sudden you've entered a realm not in which things are calculable. Tironi, Keynes, all of the people that have dealt with the hyperinflation, the word that they all use is incalculable. It is not something, the risks are not calculable. Well, that's why Frank Knight's up there. Because when you move from a regime of normal risk, I'm saying you're actually moving out of the realm in which you could say those formal rules are functioning. They're not functioning. The institution of money is not functioning. And that means the ability of people to make plans on even short-term things, from shopping lists to dental appointments, are being stymied. And when you realize that they have to go immediately from their place of work and go directly to something that has value rather than hold it. In other words, they have to rush to know exactly what it is that they need, what the food is available, where it's available. And it might not be on the shelf, but they've got to rush there as fast as they can to get it, and then there's a line. And it doesn't even end once they get into the shop. But he talks about that. He brings out some wonderfully poignant descriptions of what happens when that goes on. And he says, Simmel is right, because what happens is you've essentially liquefied the conceptual series in the minds of people. And all that's left is the angst, what do you say angst in English, of what is going to happen next. You get into the shop, you better hurry because they are changing. At the height of 1923, they are changing the prices hourly. So that money that you are holding in huge stacks, and here we can go to the pictures of them. That is actually a, what do you call it, a payroll. We're delivering to workers. That's a payroll in wagons. That's what that is. I have actually such a bill from my uncle Wilhelm, who lived through that period. They are going to just make a transaction. And then here is a piece of artwork that Wittig brings up. And you can see that, well, it speaks for itself, the imagery, the kind of desperation and the uncertainty that happens. So my question was, so what does that mean? Now, Wittig wants to tell me a particular story. Wittig, following Elias Canetti, says that all of commerce and all of modernity, well, what is this? It's massification, they say. What does massification mean? It means that everything is getting bigger, that we are just one of a series of thousands, cogs in a machine of production, on an assembly line, in consumer markets, at the voting booth. Modern life, if it's represented by democratic institutions, you're just one other vote. And so Canetti says, look, what this has done to the symbols of people's national identity. It has essentially devalued them and devalued each particular individual by making them constantly compare themselves to another. Just one in a mass, a drop in the sea. And what hyperinflation represented to Canetti was how would you say, a catalyst of modernity. So it just speeds up this process and drives people crazy. It hounds them so that they are never able to rest. And it reduces their sense of their worth, their value, those values that had been laid down from their earliest childhood of who they were and what is the right and the wrong of life. All of that stuff becomes massified, it becomes devalued, and hyperinflation does this on a mass scale. Now, Wittig agrees with that, and he says he likes Simmel because what Simmel has done is to show just how attenuated, that is to say, how abstract the concepts have become that define who we are and how we pursue our ends. It has made us brittle in that way, conceptually brittle. And that has left us vulnerable to these sorts of events. Ultimately, we're all being reduced to the mass man. And there's some talk of Ortega y Gasset and others of a conservative nature. But what Wittig does is he reinvokes Marx. And he says, Simmel got his analysis of concepts right. On the other hand, he was still a 19th century optimistic liberal. And in that, he was wrong. You see, Marx said money is the thing that can just undermine the entire life of the individual, of society, of the worker. The instrument of the extraction of surplus labor. It's an instrument of exploitation. I need to take a drink here. So Wittig says, in the spirit of Marx, Marx is more correct. How am I doing for time? You're fine. So we have to correct Simmel's optimism. Now, I don't particularly agree with that, because one of the things that one can see right away is that when people have those conceptual series lopped off and are thrown back to the immediacy of the moment, what happens? Though their time horizon shrinks again. If you can't trust the institution of money, if everything is a race against the clock, that is, even time is against you. If you can't get enough to support yourself and your family, so that the rules of acquisition of mine and thine no longer even seem to apply, what do you have left? You have to go back then to the most basic aspects. And what did we say when we talked about the absorbent mind? Basic values. What are the things that define who you are? The only thing you can do at that point is to try to organize with those who think like you, who somehow have the same understanding or goal. There is no sense that you can accommodate other people's values. From what you can see, everybody is going after the same scarce goods whose prices are constantly on the increase. It looks more like Hobbes's world rather than anything else. At that level, you're actually thrown back upon an earlier mindset, not unlike what we were talking about traditional society. To me, it seemed like rather than saying that this is a problem with modernity, what we have is a throwing back upon more traditional modes of thought. And that's why I think when these sorts of catastrophes happen, and you did say in your comment to me, Deirdre, that there are other kinds of catastrophes, like natural disasters. That's very true. There is a tendency then to look out and save your family, to help your neighbors, to go with those people who are close to you that you know and you can identify with. That's all very natural. But there is something else that's a little different from a hyperinflation than there is from a natural disaster. And that is that this is a disaster that's created by men, by human beings, by institutions. And so the human mind wants to know why and wants to invest meaning and interpret. That's why we recognize faces so well. If somebody doesn't recognize faces well or can't recognize emotional expression, we have terms for that in psychology. But most of us do a good job interpreting people's faces and remembering faces and identities, because that's how we get on in the first stages of our existence. These are the things that are really important to us. They are the rules of Gemeinschaft. They are rules of what you would call status and identity, those sorts of things. And they're laid down very, very early. When you break those conceptual series down, you're basically thrown back into that kind of world. Now what happens? Now what happens when you have this sort of disorder? They did bring back some stability. They did have the Rentenmark. They did drain away the inflation. But the damage was done. It lasted for nearly 2 years, and the people that lived through it never had a very good sense, never had a secure sense of what the future might bring. And mind you, they had just gotten over that hunger blockade. Do you know that one statistic that was cited in Taylor's work was that at one point, something like 59% of babies born, I forget in what part of Germany, had rickets, some instance of rickets. Can you imagine how the United States would react if all of a sudden something like that happened to us or anyone here in the US? I mean, in Europe, the European Union. A modern society experiencing that. Now that's why Jerry Feldman said this has got to be the archetypal phenomena for our analysis. And that's his 1,000-page tome. He said it must remain so, hopefully, forever. Because why? It's the first time it hits a modern, technologically and commercially advanced modern society. And it hit the middle classes and the working classes the hardest of all. So that was my only quibble with Witte. was that he blamed modernity, when in fact what he should have said was that this was the obligation of modernity. It's exact reverse. That when these sort of fundamental institutions of society are undermined, that's what happens. Now, I did have up there Ferdinand Tönnies. Gesellschaft, society, you can think of that as all of those institutions like banks or money itself that are necessary to allowing all of us who have particular well-defined conceptions of who we are, of what it is we wish to pursue. It allows those institutions, they allow us to pursue those various ends. There has never been the kind of order, except since the great, what did you call it, the hockey puck?
No, that's the
hockey stick.
The hockey stick.
Right, that's right, not the hockey puck, the hockey stick.
The great enrichment.
The great enrichment. Relatively short period of time when you consider human history. And that is that kind of cooperation, that kind of toleration that permits the coordination of people pursuing so many different ends and aims seems to me to be the very heart and soul of what we call the modern world. And that's why we have to be so careful about what we do to such basic institutions like currency. Now, I had some film footage for you, but instead of showing you the footage, I don't think we can show those here. Do you think that would click? Oh, yeah. All right. This was about 8 minutes.
Go ahead.
But this was one of the most popular. So people are looking for meaning. They're trying to find some way to explain what's going on. And this has become symbolic in Germany. This movie comes out in 1923. No, this is early 1922. I'm terribly sorry. Let me back up. The hyperinflation is beginning to take off, and there's a sense of dread. Now, this movie, you'll all recognize it, is Nosferatu. And so he talks about that here. So I'll go ahead and, let's see, I guess I just click here. Oops, wait a second. How would you do that? Oh, double tap. Okay. And it's a very horrible scene. He talks about the feeling of dread. You don't know what to expect. One of the great themes of this period is counterfeit. Things are not as they appear to be. And the gentleman who was invited out to Transylvania to do what he thought was a simple land deal is all of a sudden in this castle, and here we are.
It doesn't display YouTube.
Oh, it doesn't display. Oh,
it makes no sense.
Okay, don't worry about it then. Oh, that's too bad.
It's really strange because it should. Let me try.
Okay. I can just describe it. So he has big teeth. No. Okay. Okay. There we are. Okay. Counterfeit souls, you might say.
Is there an audio?
No, it's a silent film.
Okay.
They didn't have audio back then.
Yes.
I'm going to turn off the light. Turn off the light.
And you feel the sense of dread. There is music, but I don't know if it.
This is the dread of 1922.
Yes, this is early 1922. So hyperinflation is just about setting in. It was about 200, what was it? It's about 200 marks to the dollar at this point. 250. People are just uncertain about the future. And this idea that their life is being drained away. So he talks about it. And there's much more that he will pull out in this book.
That's coming out a lot.
This was his wife. She had sent him off to Transylvania. Now all of a sudden she has this premonition that something evil has happened to her husband. She's drawn out of her dream as if in a dream state. The whole point, according to Wittig, is to question what is reality and what isn't. Die Flucht in die Sachwerte. You know what that means? Flight to real values.
Yeah.
Yes, that was a common expression at this time. Where were real values to be had? Where could you actually anchor your accounts? What was real? So when you had your money and it was wasting away, you tried to find what in fact was what was real. And even the experts didn't know how to answer.
Fell asleep.
Yeah, or he's passed out from terror.
Yeah.
And so now the point is that his life has been drained from him. So that's the sense that begins his discussion of cinema in this particular book. So that's Moore now, who's the director. And we can go now to the next one. So people have this terrible sense of foreboding, the sense that their plans are not going to be. Let's stop here for just a second. And among those who are really questioning what's going on with modernity itself. Oh, can we go to the pictures? And then I'll have to have you do the other thing. Mm-hmm. This is a particularly interesting painting or etching that Wittig brings up. It was a cartoon from the time. And here you have Gutenberg. There you have a printing press. And there it's just spewing out bills upon bills upon bills. And the verbiage at the bottom was, "I did not intend this." Yes. Now this is a direct appeal to the how would you say, the Bildungsbürgertum, the educated bourgeoisie of Germany, and they're questioning their modernity. What they really are at this point. What is this what we've been striving for? Has it come to really all of this? And that picture in the middle is people of that class, the intellectuals, selling their books and their other personal effects just to try to scrape by. In the sense of futility, I mean, you see them lining up before the shops, and then some of them just down and out on the street. So we can go to the next one.
The next one's the video. Okay.
Now, here then is in the height, now or I should say, we're now getting into the thousands of marks to the dollar. We are really in April 1922 in the real throes of hyperinflation. And people are saying, well, what in the world is going on? And this becomes sort of the archetypical image of what they see society. It's the stock market. And what has happened is Switzerland was sending a contract with the Dutch through a special courier that was supposed to bring a large bunch of goods through. And this Dr. Mabuse had it actually stolen en route. And so now the announcement is made that this major contract has been stolen, and the prices will begin to fall, which would mean that the Dutch coffee and cacao companies that are directly involved in the contract would virtually face a disaster. I'll let you read it instead of just. So they're discussing what this could possibly mean for the market. Now, Dr. Mabuse is a counterfeit. He has like 5 different personalities, and that's one of them right there. He changes his costumes all the time. He's a master of everything. He knows just when to act. Sternberg is selling. Oh, then something is really foul. No. Prices are falling. Buy. And now it's starting to go down and down. Now he's had this contract stolen. What you don't know is that his men are about to find it again. This guy's losing his shirt. Now this kind of experience, you can find it, is actually occurring during the hyperinflation. And this gives people a kind of ready-made explanation. Now he's going to give the nod.
You mean of a conspiracy?
Yes, because what does the mind do? It looks for meaning. It looks to identify something we can understand. Now he buys. When it's at its lowest. And now his men come to give the word. So you'd seen all of this stuff before, so you special announcement. I may have gotten a little ahead of myself in the explanation, but it's okay, so they announced that the contract is missing. I think my copy actually repeated itself.
This is what he's buying, I think.
Yes, there you go, yes. A briefcase with the Dutch-Swiss trade contract. Found by a railway attendant, the secret contract. Oh, wow. It's been delivered to the Swiss consulate, unbroken. He did look at the contract and then resealed it. There's a scene earlier in the movie. Just playing them all like a violin. Market's gonna close. Now they announce that it's been found. Delivered to consulate unbroken. No reason to panic. Details to follow. This is Fritz Lang, by the way, one of the great directors of the period. Now look at the prices going up. Now he's going to sell. I sell. Istituto. And the market closes and he's made a killing. Okay. Oh, wait. This last scene Wittich takes to be fairly exemplary of the whole paper money mess. This last scene is the paper money mess. Paper all over the floor. Anyway, okay, so we can stop that one. And there you see the face of Dr. Mabuse. And that you will see throughout the movie. It's a very long movie, 3.5 hours. It's a long time to watch a silent movie. But there you see his real face. So you know that he has many disguises. And this idea of what's real. Okay, so go down there next. All right, and those are the various disguises that he has. His main line of work as a huckster is as a, fittingly enough, counterfeiter too. He's also a gambler. He controls people with his mind, the power of the mind, you know. But he ends in the very last scene, he goes mad with his power and dies in a heap of paper bills. And that's how he dies. This was such a popular film in Germany at the time. It seemed to cover so many of the experiences that they had directly in their own daily experience. And so Wittich makes has a great time of it, pulling it apart, and bringing that to life. So what does it mean then to question the course of modernity? The last great film that he spends some time on is this one here. And people are looking for order. And you know that some, and he has examples of them, some great German scientists were thinking what we need is more direct planning. And they wanted engineering precision. They thought this was the time to bring it on. And others thought that this would be the absolute destruction of art. So you had the artists who were saying, no, what we need is a life filled with art, the things that we love and can devote our life to. Metropolis plays off of some of these themes too. And what you see here is first the ideal of the efficiency of the machine, and then you see the darker, deeper reality that the artists have been fearing was actually coming. For all of those who would actually have to keep the machines alive and fed and running. So you get all this wonderful imagery. This is Metropolis, city of the future. So people are hungering for something that has a little bit of order, time, it's regularity, things that they can count on. A lot of the stereotypes of what it is to be German begins here. And now you see the reality. And of course, Wittich dances with Marx at this point, but that's all right. The sentiments and the feelings of people at this time, the descriptions of life under these circumstances. Thought we had some of the music from them. But that's massification.
You want the music? I think we can put it on.
Oh, do you?
We can try.
Oh, if you have it.
I'm just on the computer.
That's fine. Everyone can do that. Just keep that going just like that. So who's going to save you from a future that might look like this? Hyperinflation puts thoughts in people's minds just like that, those kinds of questions. You just feel yourself going down the shaft of the elevator.
This is the same.
This is the same Fritz Lang.
But it's also this imagization of Wells as the time machine.
Yes, indeed.
In the future, there's the workers underneath.
That's right. Now, this is after the hyperinflation, this movie, but it comes in just at the verge of the Great Depression. And these themes are still very much on people's minds about what the future holds. They're foreboding about what it means. That's why the imagery of the clock and the machines and the rhythm of it. And that's it. Well, I guess that's where it stops. Okay, so if that's the future, and you're questioning, what does it hold? And it becomes increasingly difficult to plan, and that's what happens in a depression also. I mean, everything goes in the opposite direction. And The Economist was right when it says everybody has heard of the Great Depression. And you return then to those basic fundamental values, the things that shape your identity, rules of status and identity, as we say, rules of Gemeinschaft or community. But how do you make something out of all that if you're somebody that wants to wield power? You find those things that people share in common. You find those values that you think that you can appeal to that have the most cachet, but you also then appeal to the lowest aspects of them too. Their common fears, their worst hatreds, the worst parts of their identities, their biases, their hatreds. And if you put all of that together, what are you doing? You're re-tribalizing society. And that's essentially what we see then happening in Germany with the fight both of the left and the right on the streets in Munich, in Berlin. There was for a very short time, as many of you know, a Soviet declared in Munich. That was the way things were going. And the person then who saw that opportunity to create a unity out of a plurality, you might say, that he could then use to force his way into power, is of course Adolf Hitler. Now, to me, all of that was made possible because modernity itself was rent. It was liquefied. It was the liquefaction of that earlier civilization that had grown up precisely because of that capacity of formal rules to allow for such a wide variety of plans to flourish and for the prosperity that was much of the 19th century to exist. Once that was undermined by war, famine, hyperinflation, which exacerbated all of that, and then the Great Depression, people then re-tribalized, and that's the opposite, not modernity, but it's very reverse. It's why we have to try to hold on to the foundations, the basic institutions that allow for a sound society, one of those being a sound monetary system.
Good.
So that's it.
Nobody up for questions, comments? Peter.
Well, when you read the draft, the paper, I think it's a very interesting paper which you all should read. I have a whole slew of things to say, but I'll only say one or ask this. Isn't what we're seeing here from August 1914 to early in 1933, the loss in confidence of a liberal society, isn't that the core? That in a well-functioning liberal society, there's a confidence that you can go down to the corner and buy a loaf of bread, that you won't get murdered on the way, and so on and so forth. I heard once of a woman in St. Petersburg who had been through the 900 days of the German siege. And I was told that she couldn't sleep unless there was bread in the house. If she started to go to sleep and she said, "My God, there isn't any bread in the house," she would get dressed, go out and buy bread and bring it back. So there's this, what you're arguing is that there's this permanent doubt in liberalism. Isn't that the heart of it?
Well, there's certainly the potential doubt there. Once that doubt, what I'm saying is once the doubt sets in,
then you can stir it up.
then you can stir it up.
Right.
That's what I would say.
I think that's probably true. Then it's the danger is that certain politicians will take advantage of this doubt. Instead of saying, we're all in it together,
right?
Let's not worry about this. It'll come out all right, as it had repeatedly in the 19th century.
That's right. And all of the great liberals on the eve of the First World War were convinced that that was pretty much the end of liberalism. They thought that this was going to be
on the eve.
On the eve, they were, well, I should say, right after hostilities begin.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, well, among the German national liberals like Weber himself, thought that this was an absolute and utter disaster. I mean, they locked ranks, but Hayek himself remembers the time, although he was a young man, he was in the artillery. So. But another one would be another great hero of mine is Meineke. I think we are we reading it? No, we chose not to.
We chose not to. Let me follow up with a similar question. So, I think one very important point in the paper is somehow that this modern institution and tribalism and different sorts of somehow one crowds out the other. So you're searching for certainty, you want trust, you want regularity. If the modern society is no longer capable of providing you with that, you naturally resort back to earlier form of supplying it. But of course, I mean, when it comes to so in a sense, this is a very vivid illustration of a collapse of an artificial institution such as money. But I wonder, when it comes to the ability of people to trace back causal links, what was there about, the rural occupation, the mismanagement of money, the continuous indebtedness on the part of government? So why there was no reaction to that? Or perhaps it's just because people, particularly people in mass, tend just to think at time one. So whatever is before, they don't consider it incapable of looking for.
You mean, in other words, don't people learn?
Yeah.
Well, they do, but it takes a lot of time. And here's another book I'll recommend: Monetary Regimes and Inflation, by an old friend of ours, Peter Bernholz. This is a classic in monetary history. And he traces a whole series of inflations. Actually, he even mentions one at the end of the imperial age of Rome, where they were debasing the coinage. Now, there's some debate as to how much that counts as a hyperinflation, but it certainly was a destructive moment. Why don't people learn to to question their government and to call only for hard currency. That's a very good one. And you know, I just have to say, Barinholtz has pretty much mapped on that one of, not always, but one of the main drivers of hyperinflation episodes is government debt. Now, why don't people stop government debt? Well, I'm not going to answer that. I'll let you answer that. I think you know that better than anybody. I think all of us probably have our views of that. But so government then needs to raise the funds. And one of the easiest ways, we did it in the American Revolution, for goodness sake, is to finance through tax, through inflation. Inflation can be seen, and some economists have even argued, well, use it as a tax then, call it an inflation tax, and just extract it from people out of their purchasing power by printing more. And then you get the benefit of seniorage because you get to be the first issuer of it. So why not? George Selgin has written a lot on seniorage, another good source for this sort of stuff. But people do learn, interestingly enough. But why it is that they don't call for gold and hard currency and free banking like George and Larry want us to have, Larry White. I think that they haven't learned that one yet. So, but I think there's a great deal of hesitancy in certain countries to allow for inflation. So that's why you see in Germany, and this is what I already argued in my original review of Taylor's book, is that they have now this deeply ingrained cultural capital that says, thou shalt not touch the money. Now they've eased up a bit on that, as I understand, but it's still pretty severe by comparison to other countries, by comparison to America, for example. And America is still considered to have a fairly tight money culture, but not as tight as Germany.
So to develop a taboo for inflation, you really need to have a very bad political episode.
So now
as
we're
a
gonna-
consequence.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is Venezuela right now. All I can say is the government is trying to paint this as the product of another conspiracy. In the Dr. Mabuse is America, according to, what is his name, Maduro. But this happened under his watch. And they did learn that all of his interventions, one after another, have led to the life that they are now experiencing, and they're not buying it, except the hardcore of his followers. It seems that the majority are not buying it. So there is learning there too. And thank goodness it was with that regime and not a capitalist regime that had flooded the market. Then who knows, maybe they would have taken a Marxist turn, but they're not now.
Learning is very expensive.
I wanted to ask you a question. Well, you talked about Germany and you just mentioned Venezuela. And I was wondering, because in Germany, you had hyperinflation, you had a deep psychological shock whose effects can be seen today, for example, in the statute of the Bundesbank and in the ECB. They have the sole target of fighting inflation and not achieving full employment. But in many other cases, for example, Latin American or African countries, I'm not a full expert of hyperinflation, but episodes of hyperinflation were not followed by brutal dictatorship. And could it be possible that hyperinflation was particularly bad in Germany because of cultural reasons? For example, the attachment that Germans feel to their motherland. They felt, somehow betrayed by their country.
Well, there's certainly, I'm not going to argue that there aren't going to be particularities to every place. No historian would ever say that. Like I said, we don't believe in monocausal explanations. So that is why it took the particular form that it did has to do with the particular machinations within Germany itself. Now, one of the things that I would point out is one often hears Germany mentioned, but remember, Germany is fairly young at this time. So what actually is the German spirit isn't even fully consolidated yet. So there was a lot of vying back and forth for what that would look like. You know, there was, for example, the Goldhagen thesis that somehow German culture was just inveterately, deeply anti-Semitic to the core. But that is not so if you go to those that formed up the Rhinish League or the Hanseatic League. All of those league cities were very much German, but they did not have those kinds of anti-Semitic biases. In fact, Hamburg invited a large Sephardic community to come in and do business in Hamburg. In fact, I believe Canetti himself actually descends from just such a family originally. So it really, what was going to make Germany has a lot to do with the particular vicissitudes of that moment and where the particular people came from who articulated the message that they did. You know, I've often heard it said that if the Allies had given in a little bit to Bruno, that he would have succeeded and Hitler would not have. So things can hinge on just slight moments too. But yes, the particular biases and then the particular focuses that Hitler were able to bring to it came from places that were particularly prone to those particular attitudes, and he harnessed them from the far eastern part of what was East Prussia and the southern Bavarian and Austrian views of these things. That's where he was coming from. Now, why would it not lead to necessarily tyranny in, say, someplace like Africa, or even in South America? And that's where Feldman's work came in, Gerald Feldman. And his book is called The Great Disorder, and that was published in 1993. It's very important that one make the distinction between societies that have often been existing already in a kind of hand-to-mouth existence, who'd already been impoverished for their own historical reasons. So that this is just one other thing that happens. And whatever happens after that isn't going to look that different from a society that has essentially attained modernity, has a fully functioning commercial order in which people take their daily routines for granted based upon that order. When that happens, the level of chaos, or what he called disorder, is much higher. So I'd encourage you to read then that if you have an interest in it. It's a heavy work. It can open a whole door, but it's great. It's very well written and researched.
How did the monetary unification of Germany happen? And how was the country unified in?
You mean in its original self?
Yes.
Under the Reichsmark? Yeah, that. You know, I'm not an expert in that history, so I don't want to go on too long, but that was directed by the unification process
So it was
itself.
basically Germany being Russia when it comes to money.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
Oh, it was, they used the indemnity from the French after the Franco-Prussian.
Oh, that's right, yes.
To adopt the gold standard and
There you go. There's your expert.
In 1871. There is a point of disagreement I have. I wouldn't call it sharp, because I'm not sure it matters all that much to your argument. But you accept the tale, as I would call it, of modernization. Max Weber, the Iron Cage and all that. And I think it's, I think historical research in the last century or so has cast grave doubt on this alleged contrast between modern economy and medieval or ancient economy. For instance, monetization, as people conceive of it, was not a new thing.
Right.
The Vikings, for example, were highly commercial. They would come to Ireland, say, or the Eastern England, and they had a choice: should we go in and steal, or should we trade? It depended how strong the force was that they were facing. All societies have money. There's a kind of underlying myth of the origin of money, and I think people get very confused about this because they think that coins are money and then paper money, whereas every society on earth has a means of exchange. The old tale of the double coincidence of wants that you get is not
I know.
actually anything that happens. For example, in ancient Mesopotamia, which was a highly commercial society, in a way, highly capitalist, not as was first thought in the early excavations in the 1920s, essentially a proto-social society, but it was capitalist. And the way they paid for things was with coils of silver. It was not a problem. I've actually seen the coils. They had little coils of silver, and they'd come to the market and they'd cut something off, and then the guy would weigh it, and they'd carry on. And they didn't have to have the coins, which, as you know, were invented in Anatolia about 800 years before Christ. So I think it would improve the historiography of your tale if you took away a lot of the kind of I would have to say, if I was going to be harsh about it, the obsolete historical school historiography of the ancient and medieval world.
Well, let me just say I use the term because that's, of course, what Wittig is using.
Yeah.
And they use the whole, so I kept within the bounds in my review in the terms that they were using.
That's fair.
And the other historians that have taken that kind of, like Canetti himself, that's actually a big part of it. So I've actually just recently, we were debating at Cato Unbound, Mark Koyama and Noel Johnson's thesis about the origins of religious toleration. And I was arguing for much earlier against a modernizationist, what I thought was an almost stadial theory that they were putting forth.
Oh, yeah.
They denied it. They said it's not stadial. But and pointed to the existence of cities as places of toleration much earlier, and actually had the medieval documents to show that. So I was aware of that, but for simplicity's sake, I kept the modernist language in there. Of course, I know that all sorts of things have been used as money, not just even gold and silver. For that. Yeah, absolutely.
As you said, now.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. There are lots of reasons why this begins to take off, and I know a great book that talks about it, but I think you're already familiar with it. In fact, there are 3 or 4 of them out there. Is the 4th one on its way?
Speaking of my own book, no, it's only going to be a trilogy.
Okay. But yes, no, I stuck to it only for simplicity's sake in the review.
In that case, then, an easy way of handling it would be to introduce a certain irony into it.
Okay.
A certain ironic distance. Occasional scare quotes around modern.
Oh, I can do that.
Would do the trick.
We can do that.
Because then people would realize that you're more up to date on the historiography of modernity
Sure.
versus open.
there are any other questions?
You've got me now.
It's a hugely interesting subject, particularly, I mean, for us, witnessing somehow some tribal comebacks these days.
So why did you want me to talk on this subject? Of all of the things that I could have talked about.
Well, we do have certain stream in the contemporary debate that calls for your exit in this country. Now, nobody knows what's going to be happening the day after, if ever Italy tries with the euro. I think in many ways it's just too complex, just to complicate the matter. Yeah. Certainly for our political class, but it may be, generally speaking, too complicated the matter for anybody. But if that happens, hyperinflation scenario is not that unimaginable.
So as long as exactly on Hans's point, as long as Germany is the central figure in the EU, it's not going to happen. Because to an extraordinary degree, I'm always surprised by this, the Germans now remember the hyperinflation. They may not remember it.
Yeah,
And that's why Krugman wrote what he did, because he doesn't like that.
He doesn't like that. He says,
No,
it's not true. Krugman, yeah.
Krugman, yeah, Paul
Yeah,
Krugman.
that noise, if you'll pardon some irony on my part,
Yes.
that great historian, Paul Krugman.
Yes, exactly.
Come on,
But they don't, not hyperinflation of the euro, but hyperinflation in the country.
But he was actually right about the euro.
Paul wanted to say, I have no doubt of this, Keynesian, pump-priming, fiscal policy, that's
one of
what
them.
we should do. And it's 1933 again, and we should do. That's the big
Another one.
problem. The
Yes.
problem is unemployment, not inflation. He says, oh, you monarchists who care about inflation, what silly people you are. That's
Yeah, so his speech was about Greece.
So you have both of them there. Yes, that one was about Greece, and then the other one is just about, it's always 1923.
Sure.
Like, this is this
Well, he's
hyperinflation
making
phobia.
fun of the
Yes,
of the 1923.
Yes.
But for him, it's always 1933.
exactly.
So
That's right.
So honestly, so he
Yes.
says, if there's a problem, the government should spend more. Period. It's always, springtime for Hitler.
That was a great scene, by the way.
Yeah, it was a great scene. But let me emphasize something that you said, which is that there are lots of other crises. I think the example of the plague of Athens,
Mhm.
in which Pericles died, and it had the same kind of demoralizing effect.
Yes.
The age of Pericles came to an end.
Yes.
Words lost their meaning as
Yeah.
this Thucydides said about it.
But on that, the Athenians in many ways were actually blaming the guy that brought them into war.
Yeah.
So he had a certain amount of personal responsibility. It was really his war. The oration is about justifying himself. The year before he says, it is actually quite interesting because the first of his oration is all about the fact, you trust me, we get into these. Don't blame me later because we're in these all together. But one thing which is very interesting in this Krugman piece is that he says, no, the 1923 hyperinflation didn't bring Hitler to power. It was the brewing deflation and depression. So now I think an interesting question is there some reason why deflation would not have the same, I suppose so, but it's the same
That's a very
effect
good
in
question.
undermining trust?
If this had not existed earlier.
Yeah.
And I think what people do is they go back to their previous experience. I mean, this is like knocking the last leg out from under the chair.
And the severity of the Great Depression, which arguably see, what's annoying about the film, because the economic historian and economist that you showed, is that it doesn't blame the government for hyperinflation or for the chaos in the stock market or something. It's all about the hi-hats. They all have high silk hats. And it's all about this, it's someone's conspiracy, which ends up being Jewish.
You know, the earlier crises in the ancient times, they also had the gods, of course, to blame.
Yeah, that's right.
And now, if you have something in a human institution, you're looking for somebody to blame.
Yeah, that's right.
Actually, a somebody, not a god or a deity.
That's right. That's right.
It's always a danger.
Yeah,
So-
it's kind of the deep, you were asking why people don't learn, the deep failure to understand any kind of invisible hand,
Yes.
any kind of collective event like language or something. They don't know it's this guy's fault.
The animistic fallacy.
Yeah,
It's
it's
the way that
that's
Thomas
the animistic
words and Thomas overviews.
With Krugman, though, he wants to see a particular invisible hand, and only his invisible hand.
Well, he wants a visible hand. He wants.
That's true
to
also.
go-
Yes.
He's a strange guy because he was an interesting and important economist, although he got his Nobel, in my opinion, way prematurely, because the Swedes wanted to intervene in American politics because he'd started to become a columnist. But now he's just, he writes as though he's a Democratic Party hack.
So I think there's a parallel looks like there's a parallel between Krugman's economics prize and Obama's peace prize. It says.
Yeah, that was the most embarrassing one. Come on, Art, can we get any from the,
What do you think about the thesis about Germany being the savior of the euro?
I'm not sure. Not by no means an expert.
Oh, okay.
So
I was putting you on the spot.
yeah.
And I'm not really an expert at this either, except you gave me the opportunity.
Well, that's
To,
very interesting piece?
you owe me one. That's a wonderful paper. So
I found Simmel, though, to be just really fascinating. I mean, the philosophy of money,
Simmel is terrific.
just unbelievably.
I'm a big fan of Simmel. I think he's a better sociologist than Weber.
And when I discovered that Schmuller had actually promoted him too, I mean,
Well,
went out and worked for him.
Apparently,
Wrote
he
letters.
was a kind of he wasn't good at academic politics. He was,
Yeah. But Schmuller tried to push his career, and I have to say my impressions of Schmuller rose a few notches.
Yeah,
He used to be really way down here, but when he actually worked for Simmel to try to get him an appointment, he said, "This is one of my brightest students, and he's done something here with money that you've got to look at." And that's what it is.
well, he was right.
something that he did not necessarily like, but still.
Well, from what I gather, he liked the idea that he was trying to come up with a way to understand and interpret the content of purposeful behavior. And that's the thing that unites all of these guys. That's why there's still more humanomics, I think, than people give them credit for.
This is a coinage of a friend of mine. Humanomics. Economics, you don't throw away the math, the statistics, and so on. You still have that, but you then also have the humans. And indeed, as you said, that's what Simmel was about.
Wonderful.
Because he understood what the Germans called English economics. He did.
Yeah.
That is,
Yeah.
Simmel did. I'm not so sure Schmuller.
No, I don't think Schmuller had a very good sense theoretically what was going on.
Simmel did.
He was actually quite a good intellectual historian,
Who was?
Schmuller.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but
The concept is great, but the word humanomics is really.
He hates the word. I didn't care
It's
for it
just-
very much, but I've grown accustomed to humanomics.
It sounds like,
It's
It's nice.
It's like it's coming out of Blade Runner or something.
Yes,
Yeah.
Just as long as you avoid mechanomorphism, you're okay. That was an essay by Karl Mittermeier, which is a great one, and it advocates humanomics against the mechanistic analogy. He calls it.
You didn't call it.
No, he didn't. But he wrote an essay against the kind of economics that's just all numbers and math, and he called it mechanomorphism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. It was in the Subjectivism, something edited by Israel.
Yeah,
Kurtzman. Right.
that's right. For example, Lachmann
Yes,
is very good on this.
yes. Well, they were colleagues, the two of them.
Where in South Africa?
In South Africa, Mittermeier and Lachmann were together. So how about a lecture on Lachmann?
No other points? Question? Please join me in thanking Hans for this marvelous.
Thank you for the opportunity to do this. Think about it more. Maybe I'll make something more of it. Put those